Hello friends, welcome again. Friends, we know that the whole history of English literature is divided into different periods, and each period is given a title by the historians of English literature. We have the important periods like the Elizabethan Age, the Puritan Age, the Age of Restoration, the Neoclassical Age, the Age of Romantic Revival, the Victorian Age, the Modern Age, and so on. And friends, as the students of literature, we must be acquainted with all these different periods, and that's why I have prepared these video lectures to acquaint you, to introduce you to the important elements of each and every period of English literature. And friends, in this video today we are going to discuss the important literary characteristics of the age of Romantic Revival. This age is also known as the age of Wordsworth. It is also known as the period of New Romanticism. Friends, before we discuss the important characteristics of this age, first let's try and understand how this period of Romanticism began in English literature. The first Romanticism existed in English literature during the Elizabethan Age, during the 16th century. And this at the end of 18th century, from 1798 onwards, a new period of Romanticism began, and that is why it is called Neo-Romanticism. In the year 1798, William Wordsworth published a collection of lyrics entitled as Lyrical Ballads, and this heralded a new era of Romanticism in the history of English literature. So this period of Romantic Revival begins from 1798 with the publication of Lyrical Ballads by William Wordsworth, and it continues till 32 years, and this period of Romanticism comes to an end in 1830. Here there was the end of reason, the end of realism as announced by William Wordsworth. Because before this time, before 1798, if you examine the whole 18th century, it is the period of prose literature, it is the period of satire, it is the period of reason and realism. And the poets like William Wordsworth and Coleridge, they were obsessed with this neoclassical approach to literature. And that's why they reacted against this, and they wanted to establish the importance of emotions, the importance of imagination in literature. And that's why when William Wordsworth wrote the preface to Lyrical Ballads, he wrote that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, recollected in tranquility. According to Wordsworth, poetry must express the natural, effortless, spontaneous emotions of the poet. So for the first time, after a long period, there were the poets like Wordsworth who emphasized the importance of emotions in poetry. And this is how the element of Romanticism enters in English poetry. Let's try and understand what this Romanticism is. Walter Pater, the Victorian critic of English literature, has defined Romanticism as the expression in the art of sensibility and high imaginative feelings. According to Walter Pater, what is Romanticism? According to him, Romanticism takes sensibility and imagination and feelings. So, imagination and emotions are the basic elements of Romanticism according to Walter Pater. Addition of strangeness to beauty and curiosity is also a romantic element found in poetry. According to him, the strangeness to beauty and the element of curiosity, these are also another characteristics of poetry which make it romantic poetry. So, in short, we can say that the element of imagination, emotions, beauty, supernatural elements, love for nature, love for past, all these things come together to make a poetry romantic poetry. In short, you can say that everything which thrills you, which excites you, which scintillates you, which delights you, which moves you into another world of imagination, that is always romantic. Okay? Who were the leading poets of this new romanticism? You know, Wordsworth, with the publication of lyrical ballads, began this new era. So, Wordsworth, who is known as the poet of nature, John Keats, the poet of love, S.T. Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet of supernatural, Percy Bysshe Shelley, known as the poet of liberty, freedom or revolution, Lord Byron, Sir Walter Scott, William Blake, Charles Lamb, William Blake, they were the essayists of romantic period. So these were the major writers of this new romanticism. Now let's have a look at the important features of this period of romantic revival. Break from classicism. As just now I told you, if you study the whole history of our English literature, you find that it is always action and reaction. Okay? Romanticism ends and classicism begins, and classicism ends and romanticism begins. The period of romantic revival is marked by the break from classicism. Love for nature and love for rustic life, country life are also important features of this period. Most of the poets, they escaped to the past Middle Ages. Love for freedom, much importance to the expression of emotions and use of imagination are also important in all romantic poetry. Love for supernatural elements and subjectivity as well as lyricism, these are again some another important characteristics of romantic revival. Now friends, one by one we are going to discuss all these important features of this period. The first and foremost is break from classicism. Friends, William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge, they published lyrical ballads, and their poetry was in direct opposition to the neoclassicism of the 18th century. If you read the literature of the 18th century, it is known as classical literature. Why? Because they followed the rules of the Roman poets like Horace, and they followed the rules and regulations, So this is how 18th century literature is known as classical literature, neoclassical literature. But the poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge, they were not satisfied with this classicism in poetry. They revolted against them. They discarded reason, realism, and intellectualism from poetry. In fact, if I use the words of Hamlet to describe the mental state of William Wordsworth, then I must say that the time is out of joint, O cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right. Indeed, Wordsworth wanted to set the direction of poetry in the right way, in the right path, and that he did successfully by writing his poetry. William J. Long, an important historian of English literature, he has rightly said that the Romantic movement is marked by a strong reaction and protest against the bondages of rules and customs. So, they protested against the rules and customs. Why? Because the Romantic poets wanted freedom of writing poetry. Another important feature that you find in this poetry of Romantic revival is love for nature. There is a sharp contrast or difference between the poetry written during the 18th century and the poetry written during the Romantic revival. The neoclassical poets of the 18th century, they loved artificial life of the towns, of the urbans. But on the other hand, if you read Wordsworth's poetry or John Keats' poetry or Shelley's poetry, they wanted to present the beauty of nature. These poets, these Romantic poets, they found physical as well as spiritual beauty in wild flowers, in the green fields, in the rivers, in the clouds, and in the mountains. And Wordsworth is rightly considered as the poet of nature. Why? Because in most of his lyrics we find the beauty of nature. His poems like Daffodils, Education of Nature, Rainbow, and all these poems make him the true poet of nature. Remember these lines, the beginning lines of the poem Rainbow. My heart leaps up when I behold. Behold means to see. When I see a rainbow in the sky. This is how Wordsworth was in love with nature. Love for country life is also importantly found in the poetry of the period of Romantic revival. Country life means village life, rustic life. 18th century literature presented mostly the clubs, coffee houses, the economic matters, and the aristocratic life of the people. But the French Revolution, which took place towards the end of 18th century in Europe, this event drew the people to the rustic life. The farmers revolted against the rich people who used to exploit them, and the farmers now came on the front. So the village life was now expressed in the Romantic poetry. Wordsworth and many other poets, they hated this urban life, the city life, and they depicted the nature and the country life in their poetry. P.B. Shelley and John Keats wrote poems on the life of shepherds. So new pastoral poems came into existence during this period. Emotional and spiritual relationship between man and nature, for the first time, this idea, relationship of man with nature, this became the main subject matter of poetry during this period. Another important feature of the Romantic revival is escape to Middle Ages, escape to past. Coleridge and John Keats, they escaped to the old Middle Ages where they found beauty, they found energy, they found joy to enrich their souls. They felt strange blending of beauty and curiosity in this past. And that's why when you read John Keats' poem Ode on a Grecian Urn and many others, in most of the poems, John Keats, travels in past, the castles, the past settings of the Middle Ages are found in the poems of John Keats. Walter Pater, the Victorian critic of English literature, has rightly remarked that the essential elements of the Romantic spirit are curiosity and love of beauty, and they means these poets searched for them in the Middle Ages. So Walter Pater also wants to say that the poets of this Romantic revival, they found the beauty, the element of spirit of curiosity, they found this in the Middle Ages. Love for freedom. As just now I told you, because of the French Revolution towards the end of 18th century, the common man, the poor people who were exploited by the rich people, now they revolted against them and they wanted to get freedom. So the spirit of freedom, independence, was the passion of the people of this period. And that's why much emphasis was given on liberty and freedom of the individual in the poetry written by P.B. Shelley. And that's why Shelley is known as the poet of liberty, the poet of freedom. The Romantic poets, they opposed to the inhuman approach of the 18th century aristocratic society. Most of the times, the aristocratic people, the upper class people, they behaved in an inhumane manner with the poor people, with the farmers. And Shelley goes against this, and Shelley, raises voice against this inhuman aristocratic people. He sympathized with the poor and rustic people. If you want to see an example of this spirit of liberty, you need to read Prometheus Unbound, written by Shelley, in which he gives expression to his deep love for mankind and liberty. Friends, love for supernatural is also remarkably found in the poetry written during this period. Coleridge, P.B. Shelley and John Keats, they introduced these supernatural elements in their poetry. In fact, most of the poems written by Coleridge are full of supernaturalism. And that's the reason why the critics and scholars call Coleridge as the poet of supernatural. The question is, why Coleridge wrote such poems full of supernatural elements? Then the answer is that, it is believed, if you read the biography of Coleridge, you come to know that Coleridge was habituated of taking opium. Opium, you understand, no? Something which intoxicates you, जिससे आदमी को नशा हो जाता है. ये माना जाता है कॉलेज के बारे में कि ज़्यादातर कविताएं जो कॉलेज ने लिखी है वो नशे की हालत में लिखी है. He wrote most of his poems in that sleepy mood of intoxication. And that's the reason why in his poems like Kubla Khan, Christabel, the rhyme of ancient mariner, you find such spirits, in his poetry, which make his poetry supernatural poetry. Subjectivity is also an important element of romantic poetry. Subjectivity means the expression of personal feelings or personal emotions. Most of the lyrics written during this period are subjective by nature. They are personal by nature. In these poems, most of the times we come across the words like I, my, we, us, and so on, which make this poetry subjective or personal poetry. For an example, William Wordsworth has written Daffodils, a very popular poem among the readers. This poem begins with the line, I wandered lonely as a cloud. I wandered lonely as a cloud. So the poet talks about his own loneliness. So the personal emotions are expressed in the poems of romantic revival, and that's why the poetry of this period is known as subjective poetry. And the last important characteristic of romantic revival is lyricism. Lyricism means all the qualities of lyrics are exclusively found in the poetry of this period. Lyrics are short poems, okay? So if you read John Keats' poem or S.T. Coleridge, William Wordsworth, Lord Byron, Robert Frost, these poems are very short in size. They have musical qualities. Music comes out from the words when you read the poetry of the romantic revival. Subjectivity, they express their own personal emotions, personal experiences. They focus on one single idea, and most of the poems are written in iambic pentameter lines. Okay, and all these characteristics make this romantic poetry full of lyricism. They are the fantastic lyrics of English literature. So friends, here we come to the end of this discussion on the characteristics of the poetry of the Romantic Revival. But before I leave, let me conclude the whole discussion by saying that the period of Romantic Revival, as heralded by William Wordsworth with the publication of Lyrical Ballads in 1798, it reaches its culmination in 1830. This period of 32 years is known as the period of New Romanticism. It was a sharp reaction against the neoclassicism of the age of Alexander Pope. It was a reaction against realism. It was a reaction against reason. It was a reaction against satire. And this poetry written during this period of Romantic Revival is full of imagination and emotions, love for past, love for nature, love for beauty. I finished my discussion with a nice lines said by William J. Long, the important historian of English literature. He wrote that the poetry of Romantic Age is characterized by the protest against the rules of neoclassicism of the 18th century. Return to nature, interest in common man, love for the poor, and escape to the past and touch of subjectivity in poetry. So these are the important elements of poetry found during this period according to William J. Long. He further says that the poets got their inspiration not from John Dryden and Alexander Pope. They got their inspiration from William Shakespeare, from Edmund Spenser, and from John Milton. So, the poets of this period, for them the ideals were the poets of the Elizabethan Age. And the period of Elizabethan Age is considered as the first period of Romanticism. The period of William Wordsworth and Coleridge is considered as the second period of Romanticism, and that's why it is known as Neo-Romanticism. Friends, I come to the end of this discussion. I am sure you like this video. Please share this video among your friends and subscribe to this channel. Thank you very much.